This week's topic is public opinion and voting. This PowerPoint will cover the following content. 1, the idea of voting, how values, the history of voting, voting requirements in California, and why we vote the way we do. In the next part, or the last part, I'll explain making sense of polling and the activities that you have on Canvas. Remember, this lecture follows your reading of Chapter 8. So you should have Chapter 8 already finished and ready to go. Voting history is complex, so let's just do a real quick understanding of how voting restrictions have changed over time. Number one, early 1800s, we had religious, property, and tax qualifications, and those begin to disappear or dissipate as the 1800s progress, where voting becomes more widespread and we're allowing more people to vote. By the 1870s, obviously, we have the 15th Amendment, which removes restrictions on voting based on race or color. Then you get the 19th Amendment in the 20s, obviously, which removes restrictions based on sex. We've already talked about all that. In the 1960s, we get Voting Rights Act of 65, and that enforces the racial equality at polling places. So even though we had that 15th Amendment, the restrictions were still in place with the Jim Crow laws, which we have talked about already. So the Voting Rights Act of 65 is important because it enforced restrictions on people who were restricting voting based on race. Then as you move to the 1961, kind of interesting little side note, the 23rd Amendment gets passed and all of a sudden District of Columbia residents get the right to vote for presidential electors. Prior to that, they didn't have that because District of Columbia is not a state. So that's an interesting one. In 1964, that 24th Amendment is passed, and if any of you remember history, the 24th Amendment is extremely important in 1965 because it finally eliminates the poll tax, that last piece of the Jim Crow laws that were still being implemented in certain states. And then in 71, we already talked about this, the 26th Amendment sets the minimum age for voting down to 18. And as you remember, that is due to the Vietnam War. So kind of interesting little scenario on focusing just on those voting rights for us and allowing voting to occur. Voting requirements are a state right. So remember, with the idea of federalism, states have certain controls and the federal government has others. And voting requirements are a state-controlled issue. So there are only these items here on this slide that are actually federal, which are all states have to have these. And then certain states have other requirements. So states impose different qualifications, but the basics are these universal requirements. You have to be a U.S. citizen, a resident of the state that you're registered to vote in, and you must be 18 at the time of voting. People can be denied rights based on mental incapacity, imprisonment, dishonorable discharge from the military or from armed services. Those are generally state by state. Mental incapability is determined by a court. Literacy and poll taxes, which used to disenfranchise groups, have been eliminated, as we saw in the last slide. The 24th Amendment in 1964 eliminated that poll tax. And then the Voting Rights Act of 65 eliminated most of the other Jim Crow restrictions. Today, that's the question you're going to be answering on our video. So today, what kind of restrictions have you heard about, know about, or would like to share with us? Side note, you need to remember that the quote-unquote white primary, which your textbook talks about, was a restriction not allowing any African Americans to vote in primaries. Ironically, that was upheld in the Supreme Court as constitutional, and fortunately, in 1944, that white primary was eliminated. So now we do not have that. We do have, as your textbook talks about, closed primaries. And closed primaries are elections where you have to be registered within a certain party in order to vote in the primary election. So that is a state-by-state type of qualification. All right, so as you can obviously read from the slide, but let me just go over it real quickly with you. Voting requirements in California. Essentially, these are the voting requirements in California, and one of your assignments coming up next week, you will actually be diving into this in a little more detail, so take some good notes on this. In California, you must be registered to vote in California, so you have to be registered. You have to be a U.S. citizen. That's one of the universal requirements. A resident of California, another universal requirement, and 18 on the day of election. Again, the last universal requirement. California, however, these are the ones that are restricted to California, or at least are valid in California, not currently imprisoned or on parole for the conviction of a felony. So even if you're paroled, but you were convicted of a felony, you are still at this point still not eligible to vote. Not currently found to be mentally incompetent by a court of law. So if someone has taken you to court and found you to be mentally incompetent or not mentally stable, you would not be able to vote. First-time voters do need to bring that ID or form of identification. I am hearing there are some changes to that, but I haven't read recently what they're doing for that. I believe that's still in place, that ID or some sort of ID for first-time voters. Voter restrictions are obviously in place to prevent voter fraud. There are new restrictions requiring voter ID. Your discussion at this point in the video is to look at, is voter fraud a concern? And if so, what is the concern for you? All right, now let's get into some review of what the textbook has in the textbook. Why do people vote the way they do? So the following slides will talk about the following things. So the first thing we'll talk about is party identification. If you're taking good Cornell notes, you'd put party identification on the side there on the left, leave your space, lots of space on the right for our notes in the upcoming slides. The second topic we'll talk about is perception of the candidates, policy choices, socioeconomic factors, ideological and political spectrum. All of these points are aspects that determine why people vote the way they do. All right, so that first point that we want to talk about why people vote the way they do, is party identification. It is the mainstay of voting decisions. Since 2008, partisanship or party identification, aligning with a particular party, dominated the elections about 2008 forward. If you've done our discussion post, you sort of looked at the trends of states that were Republican or Democrat and sort of identified some of those. That continues to today. There is a lot of distrust with the other party. So the mainstay about party identification, historically speaking, people were attached to their party. It really mattered what party you belonged to. People voted based on party alone. Oftentimes that was the only determination. Party allegiance definitely colored or skewed the way you voted on election platforms. This behavior, as we said, was highlighted in the 2008, where 89% of Democrats voting within their party, only 10% of them skipped over and didn't vote Democratic, which is a very slim amount. In 2008, they would have skipped over and voted for McCain. 90% of Republicans voted Republican, with only 9% of Republicans actually shifting out of the party alignment and voting for Obama. So 2008, since then, partisanship has gotten stronger, both sides being disagreeable about the other, or fearful of the other party, regardless of even if that person has similar views as you. So party identification, voting trend-wise, has very much colored our political spectrum when we're looking at voting and opinions. One of those things that you might not agree with, or you might agree with, but it is a reality at this point. The next aspect of why people vote the way they do is perception of the candidate. The character, not the qualifications, but the character of that candidate, how people view them, how people see them. It's the mask that they wear, is that perception. Perception is created by ads. It's created by media. It's created by, well, nowadays, Twitter, Facebook, and political cartoons, as you can see on my lovely political cartoon from the last election with Clinton versus Trump. Clinton, this article, obviously pro-Clinton, public service, that's what her image was. And Trump, to some people, felt that he was much more self-service. So perception of candidates is the other aspect. Real or not, the perception is built by media and by ads. All right, so moving right along, choices for voters. Some people, policy choices are one of the mainstays for why they vote the way they do. I would certainly hope that more people would consider policies rather than some of the other aspects, but the reality is policy choices isn't super high on people's list. It is oftentimes connected to economic concerns. So if people are very concerned about the economy, which probably is going to happen coming up here in this next election, given what's going on in the world, people will vote policy because of that concern. The other thing is hot button topics. So oftentimes people will vote based on things that are a hot button in issues. Things like global warming, abortion, gay rights, death penalty. Those hot button topics, and we've talked about lots of these different topics, can be a voter sway as far as why they might vote for a particular candidate or a particular person. All right, so this one's a little more complex. So let's talk about each of these five one at a time. So socioeconomic factors will definitely play into voting trends, as we saw in our video about the shifting of political parties or the realignment. So let's look at education first. So briefly, education, generally better educated generally are Republican. Recent years, a higher level of education, however, has shifted to Democratic. Oftentimes, more educated people lean towards the Democratic Party. Education is oftentimes tied to income level. So that's one of those aspects that sometimes they're tied together. The second piece of socioeconomic is occupation and income. So less government restrictions. So if you're in big business and you want less of government restrictions, i.e. you probably want or align more with Republican. But if you're on union or labor or workers side, or really looking at pro labor and trying to provide safety nets for the majority of our workers in this country, they're going to be more Democratic, because those are generally the party that has more plans for occupation and income protection. Although income stats were challenged in the Obama election of 2012, we saw a different trend in that particular election on income scale than what was typical. So higher income was okay with some higher taxes. For example, remember the high income also have a different tax bracket that doesn't really affect their real income. Go back and review that page 154 if that doesn't make sense. So sometimes if the tax isn't impacting your income or the real income, the money you're going to bring home every day, you might be okay with higher taxes, which is a little out of trend of what's normal. The next aspect for social economic is age and gender. So age differences have been very small in relative years, although 2008 and 2012, the Obama elections were tremendously supported by the young people. Many more young people came out to vote and responded in those particular elections. Young are also have a tendency to be a little more liberal on social issues, as we've probably seen even in our own class. Well, when we got to all be together. Gender, since the 1980s, the Reagan election, we saw more of a trend in the gender gap. I think that's starting to narrow a little bit. And I haven't analyzed the Trump-Clinton election on gender to see what happened with that. And in this upcoming election, who knows what's going to happen. Religion, however, on social economic factors, religion and ethnicity, religion has had the same pattern over many years. Catholic and Protestant are more likely to be Republican. Ethnicity has been shifting, as we saw when we looked at the history of political parties. Ethnicity has shifted, Republican to now being way more Democratic, and Hispanic and African American voters are moving or shifting back to the Democratic Party. The Solid South during the post-Civil War, Democrats were there was a lot of resentment of Republicans during the war, and the Republicans legislation that was passed during the war. So you had a shift during that period of time, and then that reversal of roles, as we saw. Democrats are not supportive of a government role in the economy and oppose civil rights. And then today, Democrats are supportive of civil rights and government intervention. So as you saw those realignments as things and parties reacted to trends in society, especially with civil rights and ethnicity. Geographic regions, hopefully you paid attention to that when you were looking at those maps to see, were coastal towns more apt to vote Democratic? Were they more apt to vote Republican? I'll be interested to see what your discussion posts are for that particular aspect of economic factors or socioeconomic factors. The next aspect we'll take a look at is ideological, the thought and spectrum influencing voting. So ideological is generally, remember, ideological means, are you conservative? Are you liberal? Are you moderate? Are you somewhere in the middle? So that's your ideology, not your political party. But obviously, as we saw on that spectrum, there's an ideological scale. And remember, when we talked about the first few weeks, that is a two-dimensional. So you might not be conservative on all aspects of society. You might be conservative in some aspects and liberal in others. You might be moderate in some and liberal in others. So remember, it is still two-dimensional, even when I'm looking at ideological and our voting trends, why I would vote the way I want to vote. All right, so now we come to the essential questions for your activity on polling, because I'm going to have you focus in on polling for your assignment coming up in the next couple days or as you're progressing through the module. So the essential questions for this are: what makes a high quality poll? What are polling pitfalls? What effect do polls have on the democratic process? And you will have a discussion post on that. Vocabulary, in case you're not sure what those mean, take a second to write down the vocabulary, which will come up in the video: aggregate, collective, partisan, representative, sample, and ubiquitous. So aggregate is an adjective meaning form by adding two or more amounts together. Two or more amounts together. Collective is also an adjective involving all members of a group, done or shared by a group. So, like the whole senior class. That would be a group. So that would be collective. Partisan is also an adjective meaning political party. So you belong to a partisan, you're a specific party. Let's see, what do I have next? Representative sample is a noun. In a poll, a small number of people that accurately reflects a larger population. So a small number of people that reflects or accurately reflects a larger population. Ubiquitous means widespread, seeming to be everywhere. So those, take a second to write down those particular vocab words. They'll come up in the video that's on your assignment. All right, so now let's take a look at the lowdown on the pole dance video. So it is your assignment this week. On the side there, you'll see the screenshot of your module from Canvas. You will see that it is titled Pole Dance, The Pitfalls of Polling. The instructions are at the top, so after you've read the chapter, done the lectures, looked at the videos, you'll go to this particular assignment, the pole dance pitfalls of polling, click on the pole dance video, select it, finish the video guide that is attached to that assignment. Make sure you finish that video guide so that it saves to the assignment so I can get it graded. After that, you're just going to hit next for the next assignment, which is attached to the pole dances as well. It is a video quiz. It is graded. Make sure you do that. Fill it in. Make sure you're accurate. Fill in the blanks. Take some time on it. And then the last part is putting it all together, applying all the concepts. Let's take a look at that last part. All right, so this last part is the concepts or applying the concepts of polls. So it's analyzing current polls. Essentially, again, the instructions are right there. What I'd like you to do is take a look at some of the polls. Click on the link, select a trend or something you want to focus in on, whether it's the pandemic, whether it's healthcare, whether it's climate change, whether it's the current election cycle. Look at the polls, analyze the polls. You will look at 3 different polls. So you're going to have to scroll down the page just to find 3 distinct polls and answer the questions on the assignment sheet, comparing those polls and drawing some conclusions about polls and voting and how it impacts voting and why is public opinion so important. As usual, email me with any questions. Pop into Zoom for our conferences if you need some help, and we can talk through that together. And I will see you in the next lecture.